Hey everybody, welcome back to the No Shill Zone. I'm here with Ben Cowen. How you doing, buddy?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Good, good. Well, we won't waste any time. Let's get right into it. What do you think we should start with today?
Maybe the S&P. I mean, I know the S&P has been on an absolute tear to start the year. It's tagged 4,900. I'd like to get your thoughts on it because I know when we started the year, you were thinking that it could tag 5,000, and I believe we're up at least 100 or 200 points since then. So what are your thoughts now? I mean, can it hit 5K before a larger pullback happens?
So it seems like it, right? And part of that is a psychological aspect. And I was in the camp that we weren't going to take out the previous all-time high on the S&P, which was back in 2022, January of 2022. But once we did that, once you get so close to an even number like that, it's almost like a magnet where price gets just drawn to it. So I still could be wrong, but I'm in the camp that they can push this up. One little interesting aspect in its kind of coordination with Bitcoin is that if you flip up the Bitcoin chart here and we look at the previous high on Bitcoin, the all-time high, it was basically mid November, we'll call it, right around the 10th of November. The stock market topped, if we go back to the SPX during that same period, we topped in 2022 in basically late December, right? So it was about 6 months lag. And then if you go same thing, and this is just an interesting little confluence, if we go back to that 2017 high, Bitcoin topped in mid-December, and if we look at that same high on the S&P 500 in 2000 and it occurred in late January in 2018, 6 weeks later. So the one thing I'll just throw out there is that we're basically at, I think, what, about 3 weeks since that high, maybe 3.5 weeks on Bitcoin from that recent high here. Could it be potentially that in about, let's do a quick little count out here. If we just bring up the tool, date range, let's take that out and we'll draw it out. So that would kind of put us in mid-February ish for a potential top, right? I mean, that's what I would think anyways. And again, granted, you have 7 days on crypto versus 5 days on the stock market, but somewhere in mid to, I would say, late February, it makes sense that we could be topping on the S&P. So again, just something to keep in mind, right? I mean, I don't think anything Ben or I say is written in stone, definitely not. But these are the types of things my mind looks at when we start talking about like S&P 5,000. Where could that be? When could that be? Does that put in a major top? And I'm still in the camp. And again, I'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, but I still think that the soft landing is the outlier here, where at some point we're going to see something bigger. And by the way, iRobot today laying off 31%. We know that there's been, of their workforce, there's been so many layoffs that have been announced in the last 6 weeks that it seems like there might be a little tide changing. And the last thing I'll mention as well, also, what we see is the government has been one of the key drivers in hiring over the last, really the last year. And again, you have to think about, if the government stops hiring, does that start to flip it? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Ben. What are you looking at these days?
I saw a tweet, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know how it's true, if it's true or not, but they said that it's interesting that you mentioned mid-February. They said that the last two weeks of February are like the worst weeks for the stock market.
Yeah.
So I mean, again, like, could you get a larger pullback around that time? For sure. I mean, actually the last couple election cycles we had some pull. I mean, I know last cycle it was the pandemic, but even before that, right? Like, if you were to look at 2016, in fact, you can see that, I mean, it had a bit of a drop here in the first quarter of the year, but some significant rallies leading into it. So yeah, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. The S&P does. I mean, look, you made a sort of that call at the beginning of the year that it could rally up to 5K. It's getting pretty close to that. So we'll see if it can finalize that. One thing that I saw you put out a tweet on, and I was talking a little bit about it over on my channel, was Tesla, because there's a lot of news recently about people saying that it should be taken out of the Magnificent Seven and all this other stuff. But funny enough, if we pull the chart up, let me see if I can find it. It's at this support level, right, at around 180. Do you think that if the S&P does get a push up to 5,000, that Tesla can kind of get a bounce off of this level kind of like it bounced off of this level back in November of 22. It went all the way back up to like in the 190s. Bounces over here in May of 2021 and March of 2021 as well. Be curious your thoughts on that. Do you think it can actually make this move back up to, say, some of these prior levels that we were looking at?
I do think so. I do think so. That's a great point here. Here's the same trend line on my chart. Couple things. Another trend line I like to show people here is that if you connect this to this, look at that kind of going right to that same point. So previous pivot where it got a big bounce, then it hit it here, got a big bounce, and we basically come into that same level on Tesla. The idea is you'll get a bounce, and then you have this big gap fill, and gap fills, they don't occur in crypto really, almost never, right? They occur in Bitcoin futures, right? Because you get a Friday and close and then the Sunday night open. But in stocks, they occur very readily, right? And there's this general trend where you get drawn back to those gap fills, and then that will be resistance. So it wouldn't shock me if we trade back up to like 207 on Tesla, and then that, you're right, that could coincide with the potential for the markets to maybe touch that 5,000 or pierce that 5,000 level. And one thing on the 5,000 level, part of it, the psychological side is very intriguing, because when you hit these even numbers and you break them, anyone who was bearish gets really just like, I mean, it'll crush the bears, right? And then the bullish side, anyone who was kind of on the fence still, once it gets pushed above, the media goes nuts, right? They go nuts. They talk about it. They get their pom-poms out and do cheers. And it pushes anyone on the fence to going long. And usually what ends up happening is once you annihilate the bears and everyone goes long, ask yourself, well, who else is left to go long? By the way, same thing happened essentially with the spot ETF. Everyone was pushed into this in frenzy of bullishness that once it came out, it was like, okay, well, how many people are still left to buy? And there's this kind of this void that has to be pulled back to, right, where price ends up coming down. So I think that's a great point on Tesla for a potential bounce here. And it wouldn't shock me. And today it's actually trading up with the markets generally around the flat line. Now, going to Bitcoin, can you talk us through Bitcoin dominance a little bit? What have we seen lately in Bitcoin dominance?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's back above its 20-week. And by the way, before I get to Bitcoin, I just wanted to answer your other question about sort of the soft landing. So I think you're right. I mean, like the markets right now, it seems like they're chasing every single next narrative, right? Like whatever the next narrative is, they're chasing it. And with Bitcoin dominance, what I think has happened is essentially, we got this pull below the 20-week moving average, which by the way was the first weekly close below it since 2022.
Wow.
I mean, that's how bullish dominance was in 2023. That, I mean, not a single weekly close below its 20-week moving average, or not a single weekly close below the bull mark support band, which consists of the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. Or was a period right here where it got below the 20-week, but it was still above the 21-week EMA. I think kind of what's going on here is we're sort of chasing narratives. So last couple of weeks, remember the expectation for a cut was going to be in March, right? Mm-hmm. And what happened was, I think a lot of market participants were like, great, we got rate cuts on the table. That means all the high risk stuff is going to start doing well over the mega cap stuff, right? Like, the Russell's going to outperform the S&P, or altcoins are going to outperform Bitcoin. But then what happened? We've had some geopolitical tensions take place. We've had, real GDP coming in a lot hotter than I think the market was expecting. And we've got members of the Fed pushing back on the idea of a March rate cut. And now look what happened, right? Dominance just went right back up, due in large part to the Ether Bitcoin pair. I mean, this was a massive move by Ether Bitcoin off of this low, which, by the way, I mean, it's a pretty standard move for Ether Bitcoin to sort of get these types of moves after testing those range lows, right? For it to like bounce back up and sort of move around for a while. But I think the issue is that while it is true that looser monetary policy would be, that Bitcoin dominance would sort of imply that dominance tops out, right? As looser monetary policy arrives. And I think the market was sort of starting to price that in, but then now it's like, well, we don't know that we're going to get a rate cut in March, right? And now the market's not so sure about that. And now it's sort of pushed back out until May. And then a lot of those gains that Ether Bitcoin had have now been given back. So I think that's sort of what's going on right now with dominance, is that a lot of people really want to go knee deep in the altcoin market over their Bitcoin. But I still think there's a case to be made that, Bitcoin dominance could go up, right? And I mean,
Yep.
look at today. I mean, Bitcoin is up only 1.5%. It's back up to almost to 43K, and dominance is just continuing to slowly grind higher. Look at the daily candles on dominance, right? Just slowly moving back up. I almost wonder if this is like a sort of like a double bottom down here, below the 20-week moving average, where it's now bouncing back up. So I would still say I'm bullish on it. I think for me to sort of flip my bias on it, I'd have to see some looser monetary policy. And also, I think you'd have to see it go below, right, this breakout region. And the one, sorry, last thing, the one thing that I struggle with that is that, when you look to see when it broke out last cycle, I mean, it took 140 weeks to get back below that level. So, it's only been 36 weeks. So that's why I'm still not convinced that the dominance
yet. And that makes sense. I think it's interesting because what we saw was, and this is something that even surprised me. I really thought that Ethereum might have its, run that everyone's been expecting. And we kind of saw it initially, right? Because as soon as the spot ETF was approved, Ethereum had that run because everyone's like, okay, Ethereum ETF is next on the table to be approved. And then really Ethereum just gave it all back. And honestly, even the bounces in a lot of the altcoins and Bitcoin, Ethereum arguably has lagged on that. And I was curious about that. I mean, is there still a run in Ethereum? Is there anything that could, I mean, do you think we'll eventually get that spot ETF for Ethereum?
Look, I mean, even when it got these bounces in prior cycles, I mean, it's not like it, I mean, there's definitely examples where it bounced around for months before it really gave way. So yeah, I mean, like, the spot ETF for ETH could continue to be a narrative that the market chases. I'm not suggesting that it has to break down immediately, but what I would say that if it does break down, that would be a risk-off signal for altcoins.
Right.
I mean, if especially for alt Bitcoin pairs, right? Like if ETH Bitcoin is breaking down, then that implies that dominance is just going through the roof. Bitcoin dominance is going through the roof if ETH or Bitcoin can't hold these levels. So yeah, I mean, I think certainly there could be narrative chasing there for sure. I mean, I'm sure the spot ETF stuff for Ethereum is going to continue to pop up for months to come. But and I mean, even prior moves, right? When we gave it all back, we still bounced around, put in some lower highs, and then eventually, it broke down in July, and then over here, it broke down in October. So I think investors should be prepared for it to potentially break down, but it doesn't mean that it's just going to be like, directly in that direction with no stops in between.
Do you think, I mean, turning our attention to more macro data, like, when it comes to interest rates, are you in the camp that interest rates are going to, I mean, is inflation back in the box, as they say, or do you think that, I mean, historically, if we look at the 70s, we know what happened, but is that the scenario we're here? Because I mean, I'm hearing a lot of people talking about deflation, now that we got the PCE, but at 2.9%, the narrative is now starting to switch to deflation. And I'm not convinced of that. Like, I mean, if they start cutting and money supply, continues to increase, wouldn't that potentially breed more inflation?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that first of all, I think we shouldn't be convinced of anything because a lot of it can ultimately depend on what the Fed does. I mean, if the Fed were to cut 300 basis points tomorrow and started QE, then I think it's really likely that inflation would come back. I think that what the Fed wants to avoid is exactly what you said, the 70s, where they got inflation back down to 3%. And then look what happened. It skyrocketed again.
Yeah.
And then here they got it down to 5%, and then it just went up again. And here they are at 3%. And that, that last percent is the hardest to get. It's the hardest to get that last percent out. And, I still am in the camp that that disinflation could continue, mainly because if you were to look at it per category, some of the main categories that are holding it up are housing, and housing is very much a lagging indicator, right? So I do think that housing inflation will continue to come down. But you're right. I mean, if they pivot too soon, then they run the risk of, while housing might come back down, they run the risk of watching, say, food and beverage inflation go back up or apparel inflation go back up. So yeah, I mean, let's hope they stay the course long enough, which is what they've said they're going to do. And I think one of the reasons we've seen some of them push back on the idea of a March rate cut is because they see that, GDP, real GDP was coming in at 3.3% last quarter annualized, right? And
Mhm.
we've seen other sectors. I mean, like oil has gone up some. I mean, do you have what's your insight into oil here? Because I mean, it's actually had a pretty big bounce over the last few weeks. Do you think that can continue with the geopolitical tensions going on over in the Middle East, or is that move over?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, it was really a pretty amazing move, and this is one that I actually ended up talking about in terms of there's an inverse head and shoulders here. Here's your neckline, and once we broke above that, you can see the trend really accelerated to the upside. Now, like you said, there was more Mideast tensions. Oil opened higher last night, and then obviously we've seen it sell off here. Which, by the way, that's almost exactly what's happened every time. So every time there's some escalation in the Middle East, oil opens up, especially on the weekend, and it usually sells off. But I'm not convinced we're done going up yet. I have a measured move here calculation that if we measure it out from the neckline to the trend line here, or the head of the to the trend line, you have to go up about the same amount, and that really puts us upwards of, I would say, about $82 to $83. So I'm still in the camp that we still could see a little bit higher. I think part of this is it's not just the Mideast tensions, it's also the China narrative starting to change, right? So
Right.
we've known now for 6 months, a year, that the Chinese economy's honestly, it's in the toilet, right? But what have they done lately? I mean, they're cutting bank reserves. They're stimulating out every which way. And ultimately, at some point, all that massive inflow of money is going to stimulate their economy. And if you start getting headlines and news about China, this data point stronger than expected, and everyone's going to all of a sudden say, "Uh-oh, here come the Chinese starting to rev their economy," and that's another potential catalyst for oil, which then we know translates into inflation over here as well. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if we go up. I still think the US will eventually slow more, which will kind of compensate for an increase in China, but I still think we could go up into the low to mid 80s pretty easily.
Yeah, and I was just thinking one of the things about the Ether Bitcoin chart, one of the reasons it maybe is giving back a lot of the gains is because it's not the only narrative, right? It's not the spot ETF is not the only narrative. You also
Right.
have the Bitcoin halving, which is arguably a bigger narrative. And,
Hmm.
and maybe investors are I mean, especially I mean, Bitcoin had a pretty big sell-off after the spot ETF. It's been a pretty standard sell-off for this cycle. I mean, it's about 20% or so far. But I do wonder if and I mean, the deadlines for the Ethereum ETF stuff, isn't that till like May or something?
Yeah, I
Um,
think it got knocked out till like just early summer, so somewhere around there, I think.
yeah. So I mean, what if all these investors sort of pivoted to ETH because of that? But what if the bigger narrative is just the halving and
Right.
Bitcoin dominant? If you think about it, Ether Bitcoin topped out. I mean, it had a higher high back in December of 2021 in the bull market last cycle, but this top here occurred the day of the merge.
Mm.
What if Ether Bitcoin bottoms out? I don't know, around the time of the halving, right? I mean, just thinking about in terms of shifting monetary policy and also thinking about or sorry, in things about shifting narratives, but also we could go back to looser monetary policy, around the time of the Bitcoin halving.
That's
Um,
true.
I'd be curious if maybe it tops out at the merge and then bottoms out around the halving.
Yeah, one thing, just talking about that, a couple charts I just want to show about some of the altcoins, as I know people love talking about those as well. So one thing I'm watching on Solana here is that we're now into a very, very pivotal level on Solana, and you can see this longer trend line going back to October. And look at how it basically price just kept bouncing off of this and just kept going higher and higher. You had the big final push here, and then we retraced, bounced again a few times, and broke down. Now, this is right where we are. We're right back to that trend line. So what I'm watching for here is, can this recapture the trend line on a daily closing basis? Intraday doesn't mean as much to me. It's more the daily closing basis, but I'm curious about that. And it's having a good day so far. And interestingly enough, Avalanche is kind of coming up in that same general trend. Here's a trend line sloping up.
Right.
We kind of kissed it yesterday at those highs, and now we're starting to push up. But just interesting to see, a lot of people are going to get very bullish on the altcoins again as these moves start to kind of pan out, maybe. But I would just say you have to see these levels recaptured to really believe it's not just a retrace after a big move down. Because again, for instance, Avalanche went from $50 all the way down to 27. It's now back to 36. that's not really, I mean, again, it's still way off those highs and coming into resistance. So just a little tidbit there. Just looking at Cardano, you can see the trend line on Cardano here from this top. We hit it right here. We pounded it, but it never got through. And now we're probably, I mean, it could head back up to about 53, 54 cents before starting to get into some resistance there. So anyways, yeah, some fun stuff. I feel like we got some different markets breeding different action. And I think it's important to mention too, Wednesday's the Fed, right? So 2 o'clock. And then
Right.
this week, at least in the stock market, you have Microsoft, Meta, Apple, Amazon, and Google all reporting. So it's going to be a volatile week for assets overall.
And you also have all the labor market data coming in this week.
That's
The
right.
job openings, ADP employment, non-farm, all that stuff, unemployment rate, all that stuff is coming in this week. And I mean, as far as the altcoins go, I think you make a lot of good points. I mean, my sort of interpretation on alts is that as long as Bitcoin is up here, right? As long as it's way up here, altcoins will continue to fight.
Yeah.
I think the thing to clue us in onto what's really going on under the surface is are altcoins outperforming Bitcoin, or are they just doing well against the US dollar? I mean, if they're underperforming Bitcoin but doing well against the US dollar, it sort of just implies that Bitcoin's raising them up, right?
Right.
If they're
It's a
if
risk on trade, right? Essentially
right,
risk on.
right. But if they're outperforming Bitcoin, then that would imply something different. I think that's the biggest thing. And again, here you can see that Bitcoin's up to around 43K, and the dominance of Bitcoin is just continuing to slowly climb. And I don't know, man. I got the impression that a lot of people had given up on dominance a couple of weeks ago. Right after the spot ETF, and
That's right.
everyone was flooding into ETH. And I'm like, man, look how quickly the narrative has changed. ETH is all the way back down to 0.053, right? So yeah, it's interesting just how quickly things have changed. Maybe the last
It is.
thing we should check in on. What are your thoughts on say like gold and the dollar here? Because I mean, gold
Mm.
is still above. It's still about 2,000. But it was starting to get a little bit of a move recently, but then the dollar shot up, and I think kind of stifled anything that gold was doing.
Yeah, so I think at least for me, I continue to think the gold price action, it's been kind of dead. Let's be fair, right? I mean, if you
Right.
go back to late December, we were trading around 2075, and we've basically just kind of paused or pulled back ever so slightly. But what I like to draw people's attention to here is that if you look at volatility in the stock market, the VIX is essentially at multi-year lows. Which again, if you historically look at gold's performance when it's a risk-on environment, meaning volatility is low, gold usually is getting crushed during these periods. I mean, interest rates are still high. That's usually a negative for gold. Asset prices all-time highs on Meta. I mean, Microsoft, all these other big name, trillion-dollar names. And this is the environment where historically gold does very poorly. And here it is lurking. I say lurking because to me, I do think it's going to, as soon as you get fear to inch up a little bit, I think gold starts to take off to the upside and really move up. So I think those are the big things I take away from it. And I always like to just refer, and I've said this for now the last year plus, is that the biggest buyers by a zillion% is central banks around the world. They just keep on gobbling up gold, almost like they want to go back to a gold-backed currency. Not to say Bitcoin can't replace that in the future, but at least for now, they're buying gold. And if these banks that literally control the money supply are doing that, to me, it's like, okay, well, I got to at least have part of my portfolio exposed to that.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think one of the reasons it hasn't made that move is, I mean, look at the dollar. The dollar just keeps
Yeah.
on. I mean, the dollar is continuing to climb, but it is coming into some interesting levels, right? I mean, it's coming up to the 20-week moving average. So I around 104.2, I think will be a really interesting level to see if the dollar can break through.
I have that
Um,
exact same level on my chart right here. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And actually, just for interesting sake, is if you look at the pattern formation right here off of this low channel, it's a great low channel going back to these highs. Is you had the up move, sideways consolidation, which is bullish. Then that led to another up move. And then you could see sideways consolidation and it's starting to creep up. And so I'm with you. I think like 104.20, 104.30 is probably the likely target. And what I'm curious about is, do we hit that into the Fed and then have a sell-off off of resistance, or does it get a pop on the Fed? Do we stay here into the Fed decision?
One thing that I keep going back to with the dollar is, to me, it looks a lot like the Bitcoin dominance chart a year ago.
Mm,
And I know, like, I mean, it all depends on how the economy unfolds. But if you look at it like this, right, like see these four. I mean, is it a massive accumulation zone. I don't know. I mean, if you look at this chart and then if you just quickly shift it over to the dominance of Bitcoin, look at Bitcoin dominance a year ago or a couple of years ago, right? Putting in these lows, and then it even, you even had a high and then a lower high, and then this high sort of swept that first high, right, with dominance, and then it put in a slightly higher low, then go over the dollar, right? It's doing the same thing, right? It low, lower low, lower low, but then this third one was actually a slightly higher high where it swept this. Now we've come back in, put in a higher low, just like dominance did right here. And what dominance did was it went up to the 20-week moving average, got rejected, came back down for one final higher low, and then it finally broke through and went up. And I'm looking at the dollar and I'm thinking, all right, well, let's suppose the levels, let's say, what if it gets rejected at around 104.2 and then comes back down? That's going to be a big test of it. Does it put in a higher low and then go up, or does it do something completely different and completely break that trend?
Interesting. Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. Just thinking out 6, 12, 18 months is, where's the U.S. economy at that point? Are we still in this soft landing narrative? Think about the election cycle coming up. I mean, there's so much. I mean, Bitcoin halving and like I said, the elections and all these other things at play, the Fed cutting rates. It's going to be an insane rest of the year into 2025. And man, I mean, we'll be here to guide people. And I think we can probably wrap it up with that, unless you have anything else.
The only other thing I was going to say was that, I mean, kind of so far, Bitcoin's doing what it normally has done in halving years, where it sort of gets a early halving year dip, right? And these are all prior halving years. And you can see that normally in halving years, there's this move to the downside where it goes pretty quickly below the yearly open sometime in the first 3 months. It's ranged between like 15% down to like 30 to 40% down below the yearly open. So far, though, it's actually most closely tracking 2016 so far. But I think that might be one to continue to keep an eye on, because normally what Bitcoin does for the first few months of the halving year is not a whole lot, right? I mean, it just sort of bounces around for a while, and then sometime halfway through the year, then then you can see that these moves began. So we'll see if it plays out like that again.
Awesome, buddy. No, that's super fascinating. Well, yeah, thank you for joining me as always. And thank you to the viewers out there who are watching. We have a good group here watching. So we'll be back next Monday. You're around next Monday, Ben?
Yep, should be here.
All right, man. We'll plan on it. Thank you guys all for watching. And we'll go follow, like we always say, follow our socials, follow Ben's socials. He's awesome. Follow mine if you guys get a chance as well. And we look forward to next week. Take care, guys.
See you guys.